Do we think of Jesus as a prophet? Maybe sometimes. We mainly think of him as a teacher of wonderful things. We say, what a wonderful world it would be if people all lived by the teachings of Jesus Christ. But Jesus was a prophet. He did prophesy future events. I want to consider a prophecy Jesus made not long before his death, the one known as the Mount Olivet prophecy. It's called that because it was given on the Mount of Olives, on the east side of Jerusalem. From there was a wonderful view of the temple that Herod had built in Jerusalem. It almost shone in the sunshine, in the light stone reflecting the sun. The disciples didn't often get to see it as they came from up north. So they're amazed to see it, and they point it out to Jesus. Look at these buildings here. And we read, and Jesus went out, Matthew chapter 24, verse 1. I'm going to mainly be following this through Matthew chapter 24. I'll make a few other references as well. But if you wouldn't mind, I'd like you to have Matthew chapter 24 open as we follow it through. Matthew 24, verse 1. And Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said unto them, See ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. Just so that you know, this was an amazing prophecy, as some of the stones were 70 tons each. And it's amazing how they ever got into position. But this isn't just referred to here. This seems to be an amazing prophecy that this marvelous temple is going to be destroyed. But way back in the Old Testament, in the prophecy of Daniel prophesying about the coming of the Savior Jesus Christ, says, After 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the prince, that's the Romans, will come and destroy the city and the sanctuary, that's the temple, and the end thereof shall be with a flood, and unto the end of the war desolations are determined. So this was prophesied centuries before by Daniel, if the disciples were familiar with their Bible and had read it. But more recently, John the Baptist had prophesied it. The words of John the Baptist in Matthew 3, verse 7. And when he saw many of the Pharisees and Sadducees come to his baptism, he said unto them, O generation of vipers, who hath warned you to flee from the wrath to come? The wrath to come he was mentioning there was the destruction of the city of Jerusalem and the temple by the Romans, which happened in AD 70. In the parable of the wedding feast, we read this. After the king's servants had been slain, when the king heard thereof, he was wroth and sent forth his armies and destroyed those murderers and burnt up their city. So it's actually in the parables. In the parable of the tenants in the vineyard, we read this. For when the husbandmen saw the son, they said among themselves, This is the heir, come let us kill him, and let us seize on his inheritance. And they caught him and cast him out of the vineyard and slew him. And when the Lord therefore of the vineyard cometh, what shall he do unto these husbandmen? They say unto him, He will miserably destroy these wicked men, and will let out his vineyard unto other husbandmen, which will render unto him their fruits in their seasons. So we have it there again. So this destruction in Jerusalem is several times mentioned altogether in the Bible. Disciples, however, are shocked. And so Matthew goes on to record this in Matthew chapter 24, verse 3. And as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, Tell us, when shall these things be, and what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? Now notice these questions carefully, because there are two questions here. First of all, the signs of when the temple would be destroyed, but also the second question is signs of Christ's return to the earth. This is referred to in the Bible as Christ's coming. We see that in this chapter, because in verse 27 it says, "For as the lightning cometh out of the east and shineth unto the west, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be." So the coming of the Son of Man is Jesus Christ's return to the earth. So disciples ask him two questions then. When will these things be? That's the destruction of the temple. And what will the sign be of his return to the earth? So when we come to look at the answer to the question, we've got to realize that Jesus is talking about two events. He's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 and the events leading up to that. And he's talking about his return to the earth and the events leading up to that. And to some extent, the period in between. The temple, as I say, was destroyed by the Romans in AD 70. So this prophecy covers 2,000 years of history up to the present. So let us carry on through the chapter, Matthew chapter 24. We now come to verse 5. Jesus says, "Many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many." There are going to be false Christs. It tells us to beware of them. And there were false Christs in the early centuries, and there are false Christs today. There was Simon Bar Kokhba, who led a Jewish uprising in AD 135. He claimed to be Jesus Christ. In our day, Sun Myung Moon, founder of the Unification Church, and others we haven't heard of, have claimed to be the Messiah. So we go on to verse 7, Matthew 24, verse 7. "For nation shall rise against nation, a kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in divers places." Well, let's look at this verse bit by bit, and we see how descriptive of our own age it is. We never hear the news without there's some problem between nations. We hear of the threat Iran is in the Middle East. We see Russia spreading its influence and trying to dominate the globe. And since I wrote these notes, of course, we've had the Ukraine war begin. What's different today is that it is worse. The things that Jesus describes here have always been around. People have said to me, "Well, we've always had wars. We've always had famines and pestilences." Yes, we have, but not to the extent we have today. Today it is worse. Well, let us look and see in what way it is worse. First of all, Jesus said there would be wars. Well, we've always had the army and the navy. But in 1907, the United States Air Force was formed. And so war moved into a new dimension, the Air Force. Since then, we've had chemical warfare, cyber war, and in 2019, President Trump announced a new Space Force. Only in the 20th century have we had world wars. We've never had those before. Surely we are at the time Jesus spoke of, when wars are much worse than they were before. Another new thing in our day is terrorism. An enemy with no uniform, no flag, no national border, and they can pop up anywhere and attack at any time. Jesus also prophesied famines. But what's worse today about famines to the past? Well, one thing that's new in our day is a huge population of nearly 8 billion people, all needing feeding. Also new is the threat of global warming. We've not had that before. And that's leading to climate change, and it's leading to famines. There is talk that unless urgent action is taken soon to stop it, global warming, or climate change, perhaps we should call it, will have a momentum of its own. We only have 10 years to do something, we're told. But nations are selfish. Wealthy nations don't want to pay the cost, and poor nations can't. With global warming, the sea level will rise, flooding coastal communities. Climate change has led to freak weather, huge storms and fires. This has led to famines in some places, and drought in others, and floods in others. And when we come to pestilences, Jesus mentioned pestilences. Well, as soon as they find a cure for one disease, up pops another one. We had AIDS, then we had Ebola, and then we had the coronavirus. And this is a comment that I read about the coronavirus. The coronavirus is understood to have originated in a wet market in the Chinese city of Wuhan, with the original host believed to be bats. We've seen this happen before, Professor Cunningham told the Telegraph. Unless human behaviors and activities change, we're going to see it happen again. The frequency of occurrence of zoonotic spillover is increasing in recent decades. That is because of the way we interact with wildlife now. All these things have happened in the last 50, 60 years. We are living in an entirely different world. And these aren't words by somebody trying to prove the Bible right. These are words by someone independent of the Bible. We have created an entirely unnatural ecosystem for ourselves that is leading to the increased chance of novel pathogen spillover from wildlife to people. The next thing on the list that Jesus prophesies there'll be more of is earthquakes. Now we now know that these are caused by movements of tectonic plates, large pieces of the Earth's crust which move slowly and collide. Earthquakes are often at the joins of two plates. Well, why is this worse today? Well, the joins where plates join is where a lot of people tend to live. And the reason for that is that there are good resources there, good minerals. And so as the population increases, the effect of earthquakes will naturally get worse. Jesus goes on in verse 9, then shall they deliver you to be afflicted, and shall kill you, and ye shall be hated of all nations for my name's sake. Just look at the persecution there's been of believers in Jesus Christ. There is much recorded in the book of Acts of the Apostles in the Bible. But down the ages, the Catholic Church has persecuted Protestants who reject the authority of the Pope. There was a Spanish Inquisition from 1478 to 1834, and the massacre of Bartholomew in 1572. Today, Boris Johnson has stated that he wants to defend persecuted Christians. Many Iranians are fleeing to Britain today because of religious persecution. So we go on in Matthew 24, we come to verse 14. And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come. And some say this refers to the gospel being preached throughout the Roman Empire before the destruction of the temple in AD 70. But while this may be so, Jesus is also giving signs of his second coming, remember. Well, only now is the gospel being translated into almost every language. By 2018, the full Bible had been translated into 683 languages, and the New Testament into an additional 1,534. By the 1990s, the New Testament was available in more than 100 languages in Papua New Guinea alone. This is a sure sign that Christ's return is near. The gospel will be preached to all the world as a witness, and then shall the end come. So we go on to verse 15. When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place, whosoever readeth, let him understand. Then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. Let him which is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house. Well, we need to explain what is meant by an abomination. Daniel prophesied an abomination, stand in the most holy place. An abomination to the Jews was a building for some other false religion. Daniel prophesied there would be one on the wing of the temple, put there by the people who destroyed Herod's temple, which was the Romans. But before that, Daniel said the city and the temple would be destroyed. Now Luke also gives a record of the same prophecy of Jesus, but Luke has a little bit more detail. And we find this in Luke chapter 21, verse 20. It says, "And when you see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. Then let them which are in Judea flee to the mountains, and them which are in the midst of it depart out. And let not them which are in the countries enter thereinto." Well, this prophecy of Jesus leaves us with a bit of a puzzle. How do you flee from a city that's encompassed with armies? That's what he told them to do. When you see Jerusalem encompassed with armies, then flee. Well, anyone reading this would be a mystery until it happened. But Jesus knew there would be a chance for them to flee. But how did he know? Only by God's power. Now, what happened was this. The Romans besieged Jerusalem in October AD 66, led by Vespasian and his son Titus. In May 69, Emperor Nero committed suicide after his burning of Rome, and Vespasian, keen on perhaps being the next emperor, halted the siege and went back to Rome. Now, this gave the Jews a chance to flee. They had a small window of opportunity, and it was all because Nero died. Those who tried to flee from Jerusalem were called cowards, but Jesus had said to flee. Those who ignored his warning almost all perished. What happened afterwards? That Titus returned in force to Jerusalem with an army, and after a 5-month siege, the city was destroyed. So those who heeded the warning of Jesus were saved, and those who didn't were killed. Jesus made another prediction in Luke 19. He says, "For the day shall come upon thee, that thine enemies shall cast a trench about thee, and compass thee about, and keep thee in on every side, and shall lay thee even with the ground, and thy children within thee. And they shall not leave in thee one stone upon another, because thou knewest not the time of thy visitation." That is, they didn't know that their Messiah had come to save them. Now, the word trench there means a rampart or a mound. Now, in the siege of Jerusalem I've been talking about, the Romans built a wall all the way around the city to stop any Jews escaping. Barnes' commentary tells us this. Titus, in order that he might compel the city to surrender by famine, built a wall round the whole circumference of the city. This wall was nearly 5 miles in length and was furnished with 13 castles or towers. This work was completed with incredible labor in just 10 days. But Jesus forecast that then, that they would put a trench about them or a wall. Carrying on in Matthew, we now come to verse 21. "For then shall be great tribulation, such was not since the beginning of the world to this time, nor ever shall be." So what is ahead of us? We wonder what is going to unfold in the coming days. In AD 70, some mothers ate their own children in the siege of Jerusalem in AD 70. It's all described by the Jewish historian Josephus, who was there. But remembering that Jesus is also talking about his return to the earth, look at the tribulation today. Look at the number of refugees fleeing persecution all over the world today. For example, many Persians have come to this country, and many have become Christadelphians. Matthew chapter 24, verse 22 goes on. "Except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved, but for the elect's sake those days shall be shortened. And only this last week I've read a forecast by a professor that civilization could break down completely in the next 4 years or so. And the reason is things like global warming and the wars that are going on in the world at the current time could lead to that collapse of civilization. Quite a thought. Now, no doubt this prophecy applies to AD 70, where very few in the city survived. But what about today? Could Jesus be talking about today, that no flesh should be saved? Well, plastic pollution is getting into the stomachs of birds and fish, as a result of which, unless they can regurgitate it, they will starve. Microparticles of plastic are getting into our food. They've been found at the bottom of the ocean and up Everest. Birds have it in their organs. Doubt has been expressed over how long the Earth will be habitable or whether civilization will collapse. Forests are being felled at an alarming rate. The ozone layer is depleted. The sea is warming, and there is a decrease in oxygen in the ocean in places, a decrease in plankton, acidification, and the sea levels rising. The number of insects is decreasing, including the honeybee, which is necessary for our survival. Many animals are facing extinction. The 16-year-old Greta Thunberg and a 94-year-old Sir David Attenborough have been warning the world we only have so long to act. The coronavirus caused the global warming problem to be postponed. It can also hamper the efforts to get rid of locust swarms and the efforts of people flooded to get their properties sorted. So you see how it compounds itself. Now one problem makes another problem worse. We're going back to Matthew 24, verse 15. Jesus prophesied an abomination on the temple site. Just to remind you, it says, "When you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whosoever readeth, let him understand." And to remind you that an abomination was false worship. Let's look at the history of false worship on the temple site. The Romans offered a swine at the east gate of the temple in AD 70. That's just a sample of what was coming. The first long-lasting abomination was the Roman pagan temple of Jupiter Capitolinus, built in AD 135. Then the pagan sanctuary of Venus, also in Jerusalem, AD 135. The next was a Christian basilica built by Constantine over the supposed tomb of Christ, built in AD 325 and destroyed in 614. But the enduring one was when Omar built his wooden dome of the rock deliberately on the temple site in Jerusalem in AD 657, which was replaced by a stone building in about AD 690. That is still there as an abomination on the temple site, preventing Jews from building a temple there. If we could turn to Luke for a moment, Luke adds extra information about what will happen after the fall of Jerusalem. Luke 21, verse 24. "And they shall fall by the edge of the sword, and shall be led away captive into all nations, and Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of Gentiles be fulfilled." So Luke adds extra information about what will happen to the nation of the Jews between the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 and Christ's return to the earth. He says they'll fall by the edge of the sword and be led away captive. Jews were sold as slaves throughout the Roman Empire, and many died of want because there was a glut of slaves, and they did not all find buyers. Later they went into all the world, and it was hard to find a country with no Jews living there. Jews were disliked. There was universal anti-Semitism. and they had to flee from country to country. They had to live by their wits in order to survive, and became traders and helped each other with everything, from getting employment to getting a wife. Jews had to marry Jews. In many countries, Jews were treated like animals. They had to pay a toll to go over a bridge like a donkey. They could not send their children to the same schools as other children. In many cities, they had to live in the Jewish quarter, called a pale or a ghetto. We get references to the Jewish pale, and from that we get the expression of going beyond the pale. There were many massacres of Jews. Some were baptized as Christians by force. Jesus said this would be until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. Well, when was this? Well, about the time of the French Revolution, the tide turned. Jews were emancipated country by country to the level of other nationalities. France in 1791, 1812 Prussia, 1858 Britain, 1871 Germany. So one by one, Jews were emancipated in different countries. Previously to that, they were treated like animals. The Bible scholars knew that the fall of the Turkish Empire was needed before Israel could return to their homeland. And slowly but surely this took place. In 1897, we had the first Zionist Congress, established by Theodor Herzl, with the object of establishing Palestine as a national home for the Jews. In 1917 came the British Declaration by Prime Minister Balfour. His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. Then in the Second World War, Hitler tried to destroy all Jews, moving them on trains in huge numbers to prison camps where they were killed in gas chambers and burnt in ovens. He managed to kill 6 million or so before his death. But in 1848, the Jewish state was established by the newly formed United Nations. Jews began returning in huge numbers to Jerusalem from all over the world. In 1967, the Six-Day War took place in Israel, when the old city of Jerusalem was taken by Israel, except for the temple site. Then in 1992 began the unsuccessful peace process, which has only recently begun to bear fruit with the Abraham Accords. Jews returned to Israel in such things as Operation Magic Carpet and Operation Moses. A few countries moved their embassies to Jerusalem. As we speak, there are still 100 countries in the world with 100 or more Jews in, and the number of Jews in Israel has just overtaken the number in America. Jesus said Jerusalem would be occupied by Gentile powers. He said Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles. Here is a list in sequence of all the Gentile powers that have occupied Jerusalem. First the Romans, then the Persians briefly, then the Arabs, then the Turks, then the Egyptians, then the Crusaders, then the Egyptians again, then the Turks again, then Britain from 1917 to 1947, and then Israel formed a state in 1948, but only occupied the old city of Jerusalem in 1967. It really has been trodden down of Gentiles, many different Gentiles. But when were the times of Gentiles fulfilled? Some would say this was fulfilled in 1967, when the old city was conquered by Israel in the Six-Day War. But still Muslims have jurisdiction over the Temple Mount. Going back to Matthew's Gospel, he adds in verse 32, Now learn a parable of the fig tree. When his branch is yet tender and putteth forth leaves, you know the summer is nigh. So likewise ye, when you see all these things, know that it is near, even at the doors. Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. Well, the Bible's full of parables, and this is another parable. And we have to ask ourselves, what does the fig tree mean? Parable of the fig tree. The fig tree was the favorite of all trees in Israel. Well, let the Bible be its own expositor. Where else is the fig tree mentioned? The previous reference to a fig tree in the Bible is Matthew chapter 20, verse 18, where Jesus came to a fig tree with no fruit on it and cursed it, and it died. Now, that tree obviously represented Israel. We can see by the context. It says, when Jesus saw a fig tree in the way, he came to it and found nothing on it but leaves, and said to it, let no fruit grow on thee henceforward forever. And presently the fig tree withered away. And when the disciples saw it, they marveled, saying, how soon is the fig tree withered away? Now we know this represents Israel, because just before that incident, Jesus had gone into the temple and overturned the tables of the money changers and dove sellers in the temple, accusing them of making God's house a den of thieves. And later in Matthew chapter 23, verse 38, he says, your house is left unto you desolate. There is an obvious link with the incident in the temple and the cursing of the fig tree, and afterwards the prophecy we're looking at now of the destruction of the temple. So he tells us, now learn a parable of the fig tree. When his branch is yet tender and putteth forth leaves, you know the summer is nigh. If the cursing of the fig tree is a dissolution of the state of Israel, then this is a prophecy of the revival of the nation of Israel before Christ returned to the earth. But notice, in the Bible, the key to understanding the Bible is watch every word. Watch what it says and watch what it doesn't say. The fig tree now has leaves, no mention of fruit. And we know what fruit represents in the Bible. Fruits to God, fruits to God's glory. So the nation of Israel has no fruit yet. Israel have gone back to the land mainly in disbelief of Jesus Christ. So no fruit to God. The return of Israel is a huge sign of Christ's near return. Returning to the Gospel of Luke, we now come to verse 25. There shall be signs in the sun and in the moon and in the stars, and upon the earth the stress of nations with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring. The Bible often uses symbolical language. The sun, moon, and stars often refer to the political heavens in the Bible, governments, rulers, etc., and the earth and the sea, the common people. An earthquake, then, would be a revolution or a coup. And we see this going on everywhere. We see protests against governments, we see governments overthrown, and we see refugees. Then in verse 26 it says, men's hearts failing them for fear, and for looking after those things which are coming on the earth, for the powers of heaven shall be shaken. We've seen men's hearts failing them for fear so many times. Just think of the September the 11th, 2001 atrocity on the World Trade Center. This is all very grim. Prophecies of doom, civilization in danger. We should be worried, should we not? Well, we aren't, because look at what comes next. Verse 30. And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he shall send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the earth even unto the other. And Luke adds, and when these things begin to come to pass, then look up and lift up your heads, for your redemption draweth nigh. When they begin, he says, they seem to have begun. Well, we have pestilences, we have climate change leading to famines and floods, and we have armed conflict. A lot of things happening all together, all happening at the same time. A sign that Jesus will return and gather his saints in judgment. Christ will redeem us from these horrors. But I must give you the warning that Luke gives us at the end. Verse 34. He says, take heed to yourselves, lest at any time your hearts be overcharged with surfeiting and drunkenness, cares of this life, so that day come upon you unawares. For as a snare shall come on all them that dwell on the face of the whole earth. What a description of our age this is. People absorbed in pleasure and forgetting God with absolutely no cognizance of what's about to happen. No idea that the return of Jesus Christ is so near. Watch ye therefore, and pray always, that ye may be accounted worthy to escape all these things that shall come to pass and to stand before the Son of Man. So there is a warning to us, believers and unbelievers alike. None of us can sit on our laurels. We all got to watch ourselves, because return of the Lord is near. Are we ready to meet our Lord? Have we taken on his name in baptism? Is our lifestyle what he expects of us? If not, we don't know how long we've got. Thank you.